So my topic today, as Nick already introduced, is on the peculiar warfare. Now, this word peculiar is kind of peculiar, right? What does it mean? When something is peculiar, it is a characteristic of only one person, group, or thing. It is something distinctive about them. It is also something that's outside of the usual or the normal. So when you see something out of the ordinary, something that is, you don't expect, it is kind of peculiar. So what makes this topic, why is it a peculiar warfare? Well, this weekend we heard about various forms of warfare, right? There is a definite warfare over the salvation of souls. So when we want to bring people to believe, there's a warfare that I think every Christian is aware of when we do evangelism, right? There's a battle going on there. But that's not what this warfare is about. There's a warfare that is involved with just simply living our day-to-day lives as Christians. There are battles. We were singing a song just now, This We Know. Why do we say in the lyrics that He is our way when there is no way, or our peace in the darkest times? It's because there is this battle going on, and He is kind of our King David. That's the warfare we'll be talking about through this entire weekend. But this peculiar warfare is also not that. What this warfare is about is when, as a corporate body of believers, when we start to have a vision for and to see and to realize God's full plan and purpose and start executing it, that's when this peculiar warfare happens. It is distinctive, it is strange, it is not the normal. And it's really funny that God put a book in the Bible that talks so into detail about peculiar warfare, because the book of Nehemiah is just all about that, right? In this book, if you're familiar with it, the wall is a type of God's full plan and purpose. When they're building this wall, when the Israelites exiles are being brought back from exile, they are building this wall, and this wall represents the fulfillment of God's plan and purpose. I want to give you a brief introduction about Nehemiah, because we're going to be diving deep into it. And I think the historical context about who Nehemiah is, and also the people that were in the land while Nehemiah was coming back to Israel, is very important. So Nehemiah, he actually held, so his time is during the exile time, right? He was living outside of Israel. He was in the kingdom of Persia. He was in a very highly worldly position. He was the cupbearer to the king of Persia at the time. So what that meant was he was very close to the king, because he had to taste his food, make sure it was not poisoned, make sure everything was okay. And he would regularly be talking about things about political, whatever things with the king, right? That's something he would be very well versed in. Nehemiah had a heart for God's people and for the city of God. So one day when he was serving wine to the king saw that his face was saddened. And the king asked him, "Why are you sad?" And Nehemiah said, I have a heart for my people. I want to go rebuild the walls that stand in disarray. I want to bring people back to God, to the God that I worship. So that's kind of who Nehemiah was. And who are the enemies in this case? In every warfare, there's an enemy, right? We're fighting against something. So who were the enemy? To read who the enemy was, we need to go back a bit in history. We need to go back into when the Israelites were taken into captivity. That happened. You can read about it in 2 Kings chapter 17. We read about when the Israelites were taken out of it. There were people the land wasn't just left kind of desolate, right? The kings at the time brought people in to occupy the land, to make sure that, you know, everything was, we can still farm there, they can still have livestock there. So at that time, the people that were brought in, they were from the outside areas, and there were also some poor people of the Israelites that were left to kind of be in the land. But while they were in this land, they were met with some unfriendly things, let's put it that way. There was a specific example in 2 Kings chapter 17 where the people would always have like lions or things from the outside come and destroy their livestock. The lions would come in and eat their livestock, and the people didn't know what was going on. Why is this happening to us? So they realized that, well, maybe it's because we don't know the God of this land. Maybe it's because we need to learn the practices of the people that were in this land and do the same things. And that way, we would have our, you know, livestock and everything. Our welfare will be, you know, in our hands. So what they did was they brought a high priest that was taken into exile, and they brought him back to teach the people of the land the laws, so that they will learn about God's precepts, about God's laws, and do them, right? Which is very good. You know, people are learning about God, and they are coming to him and realizing something. But at the end of the verse, so at verse 33, if you want to turn your Bibles with me to 2 Kings chapter 17, and just read verse 33, because it paints a really peculiar situation in the people's hearts. We read that, I'm reading from, I think this is the English Standard Version. So they feared the Lord, but, and this is a big but they also served their own gods, after the manner of the nations from among whom they have been carried away. So this is really, really peculiar, isn't it? We have people who want to learn about God, who want to do the law and, you know, be part of this, but they're also worshiping their own gods. That's a really strange situation to be in. T. Austin Sparks described these people as superstitious. They only believe God to the extent that benefited them. If it benefited my livestock, if it benefited my life, I would believe. But the moment that it starts impinging on my life, I'm going to kind of say, I'm not so good with that. And when I first read this verse, I asked myself that if it was possible that I am part of this superstitious group. You know, what if in the book of Nehemiah, I could be the enemy of what God's full plan and purpose? And it's a hard question to ask. And when I meditated on it, we have to come before. I mean, this is something that we all have to do to God ourselves. We have to stand before God and search our hearts. But yeah, I came to the conclusion that I simply can't be satisfied with knowing about God. Like that's if I just know about him, and I know about his precepts, and I know what to do at every single given time. That's very much me being a superstitious Christian almost. And I want to make sure that in my heart I am dedicated. And we've seen speakers previously have this topic about the dedication. Have a dedicated heart towards God. And that's where I arrived at. But going back to the enemies in this chapter, we have 3 names mentioned in the book of Nehemiah by the name of Sanballat, Tobiah, and Geshem. And at some point I think it's also called Geshmu, but they were referring to the same person. Sanballat was, so these 3 people, first of all, they are like the leaders that were standing opposed to Nehemiah in the book of Nehemiah. And Sanballat was called the Horonite, and Theophilus Sparks said he's likely somebody or someone from Ben-Horon, which is a city from Samaria. So if we go back to what we read in 2 Kings, he was part of the people that came in and settled in the land. So he is the exact kind of people that we just talked about. He represents that type of people. And then we have Tobiah. Tobiah's name is interesting because if you break it up, you can spell it as Tobiah with a J in the middle. And what that name means is God is good. Now, Tobiah was associated with the Amorites. And historically in the Old Testament, the Amorites were always standing opposed to the people of God. So from that history, you can kind of infer what he means. Because his name means God is good, he's somehow linked with God in a way, but ultimately still is an opposer because he represents the opposition towards the full plan and purpose of God. And lastly, you have Geshem. The scripture simply says he's an Arabian, so that's likely to be a descendant from Esau or from Ishmael. And in the Bible, they're both representations of kind of of the flesh, of a fleshly nature, a fleshly believer. And we're going to talk about that a bit. I mean, it's kind of crazy to say that I'm a believer, I'm not made of flesh. Of course I'm made of flesh, but we're talking about a spiritual meaning behind that. Yes, so this quote from the book I found really impactful for me. Austin Sparks is saying, "Is it not strange that when you are bent upon the whole counsel and purpose of God, you find your main opposition from Christians and Christian leaders, far more than from the world? Oh, strange anomaly. They are afraid that if the Lord has more, they will have less." And these are the foes that we are thinking of in the book of Nehemiah. Yeah, let that sink in a bit because, when I was thinking about this myself, if I was part of this group and can I be possibly stand opposed towards God's plan and purpose because I am not dedicated to the Lord? It requires meditation and requires some personal prayer. So in summary, these three people, these three names that I just mentioned, they all represent sort of the carnal and fleshly men that stood opposed to God's full plan and purpose. And they might not all be unbelievers. Some of them might even, agree with the fact that, I am saved in Jesus. I might agree with the fact that I believe in Jesus. I agree with the basic principles of Christianity. But when it comes to knowing the Lord, and when it comes to putting it on the line for God's full plan and purpose, there seems to be a shyness, a resistance, or even outright opposition towards that. And as a New Testament example, there was a group of people that Austin Sparks mentioned called the Judaizers. I actually did a bit of research on this yesterday, so I'm not too well versed in this topic, but from what I understand, they were simply a group of people that still believed, that Jesus was the thing. They might be Christians themselves, but they stood opposed to Paul in his ministry, saying that, every single believer needs to be circumcised physically. In a sense, bring the Old Testament limitations to the New Testament. But yet we know that Christ said that this gospel is for all, right? For all, is for everyone. Everyone can have salvation. So what are they doing? They're standing opposed to the full plan and purpose that Christ has set out. And if you look behind them, they have connections with the government at the time, right? They are people of influence. They are people likely connected with the government of the time. So they were looking to use this as a way of gaining influence. They did not really go for the full plan and purpose of God. They saw this, in fact, they saw the full plan and purpose of God as detrimental to their own plan. And that was why they became sort of the enemies of Paul. All right, so now that we know the enemy, let's go into exactly what they are doing. Why is this a peculiar warfare? And in the book of Nehemiah, there are a lot of points covered. I'll try to go through them in a concise way. But if you read the book of Nehemiah, there is so much in this, around this topic, that we should go in there. our brother Carl here always says that, when somebody says a message up here, we're just putting sort of X's on a treasure map. And all these points that anybody's sharing on this podium is just X's on this treasure map for you to discover. And I'm hoping to lay some X's here for you to look into in Nehemiah, because some of these are, I think really they could be full messages on their own. And to make this more digestible, I want to kind of, as an audience, want you to keep 3 things in mind. I want you to keep it, as we go through these points, I want you to think about what the enemy is doing, what action Nehemiah is doing as sort of to fight back against it. And then 3, how can we relate to it in today's life? Because this is in the Old Testament, so some things, they're just types and examples of the spiritual life. So if you take those 3 words, the what, the action, and the relate, you see that the first 3 letters spell out war. So something to help you kind of go through this list of items, because there is a lot, and I hope I won't go too fast over them. So before the work even starts, we have to take note of the state of sort of how God's name and God's people are being looked upon by the surrounding nations. So we read in Nehemiah chapter 2, verse 17, "Then I, Nehemiah, said to them, 'You see the trouble we are in, how Jerusalem lies in ruins with its gates burned. Come, let us build the wall of Jerusalem, that we may no longer suffer derision.'" So before the work even started, there was already sort of God's name is disgraced, and for some reason, believers are like people at the time who were like believed in God. They were looked down upon, and that served as a discouragement from the start. Before the work even starts, you're already discouraged. Like, why am I doing this? Right? I don't get anything out of this. So let's keep reading. So Sanballat, if you remember, that was one of the names. Sanballat heard that we were building the wall. He was angry and greatly enraged, and he jeered at the Jews. "What are these feeble Jews doing? Will they finish up in a day?" Tobiah the Amorite was beside him, and he said, "If a fox goes up on it, he will break down their stone wall. Hear, O our God, for we are despised. Turn back their taunts on their own heads, and give them up to be plundered in the land where they are captives." I am paraphrasing the verses a bit because it gets quite long, and I want to capture sort of the key points in the verses. And I think the best way that I can kind of relate to this verse is kind of think from my perspective as the head of AV, because sometimes, I do feel like I'm coming from Tobiah's perspective. I do feel like, maybe we don't have good enough lights, maybe we don't have good enough sound system, maybe there's things that can be improved to make the services so much better compared to all the other churches out there, right? So it almost feels to me that if a fox were to jump on our like proverbial wall, it would fall down because it's just not good enough. But then we also need to recognize that this work we're doing is God's work. And Nehemiah said it in a previous verse I didn't include here, but this work we're doing is God's work. And we are building up his body, and God does not need fancy walls for that to happen. So this doesn't really matter, right? And I think in his response, Nehemiah realized this, and he simply said, "Turn back their taunts on their own head because they don't know what they're saying, and give them up to be plundered in the land where they're captives." Okay, so the work is continuing. So Nehemiah has continued doing this work, and now here's something interesting, because at this point, the wall is pretty much half built. They're almost completed. And they don't show any sign of stopping. Let's read this verse. So this is from Nehemiah chapter 4, verses 7 to 9 now. And we hear that the repairing of the walls of Jerusalem was going forward, and that the breaches were beginning to be closed. And the enemies, they were very angry. And they plotted together to come and fight against Jerusalem and to cause confusion in it. And we prayed to our God and set a guard as protection against them day and night. We heard from previous sessions about the reason why this conflict ever exists. And as Nagar was saying, let's change why do we want to have a change of mindset to, let's say, welcome the conflict? Why do we want to welcome this conflict? Well, when we are doing something right, when we're on the right track, and we are actually becoming a problem for the enemy, he's not going to stay quiet. There's definitely going to be opposition. There's definitely going to be kind of like sneaky attacks, subterfuge, like almost like spycraft, right? In today's military environment, I guess. And when these things come, it is almost a sign to us that we are on the right track. So it's almost kind of dangerous when these conflicts don't come, when these attacks are kind of not bothering us at all, because it doesn't bother Satan. It's not his problem. So Nehemiah's action on this was, he said, they prayed to God and set up a guard and protection against them day and night. This, for us, has a spiritual connotation, right? Because the sword of the Spirit and the word that we read and the prayer that we make is a type of setting guard for our brothers and sisters who may be building the wall. So those of us who are involved in building up the church, whether it be the elders or people who are actually in service and the person that is preaching up here every Sunday, we should learn from Nehemiah and stand as guard for them and protect them from the enemy's attacks, because those can happen. Even though there's actually no action being taken here, like that, the enemy is just instilling fear in the people, but we still need to pray. We can't just do nothing. We have to keep everyone protected. And immediately after this, this tiredness. So now we kind of shift a bit of perspective, because for the previous few things, we were talking about things that were happening outside the walls. But now we're coming inside the walls and looking at what's the mind and the status of the people inside. So now, immediately after wrath, we see tiredness. Why is that? It's almost like linked hand in hand with the wrath of the enemy. And I think people who are in this church can all attest to this. If we're not tired physically from the wrath of the enemy, then we are tired mentally. It wears us down. We were saying that as part of the youth conference that before the weeks leading to that event, there were a lot of things that needed a prayer. There were a lot of things that were happening in people's lives that were tiring them out. They were planning not to come because it was tiring them out. And this is exactly what we see in Nehemiah. Well, actually, let me read this verse because we never read that. So this is now in Nehemiah chapter 4, verse 10. So in Judah it was said, the strength of those who bear their burdens is falling. And our enemies said, they will not know or see till we come along them and kill them and stop the work. So I stationed people by their clans with their swords, their spears, and their bows. And I looked and arose and said, do not be afraid of them. Remember the Lord who is great and awesome, and fight for your brothers, your sons, your daughters, your wives, and your homes. So I should have said the verse first, but essentially the tiredness, again, is from this wrath, and the only way we can really fight for this is be unified and to pray for each other. Oh, I'm sorry, the text here might be a bit small. Let me go back here. Okay. So let's see what Nehemiah is doing as an action. So he says, from that day on, half of my servants worked on construction and half held the spears, shield bows, and coats of mail. And the leaders stood behind the whole house of Judah. Each labored on the work with one hand and held his weapon with the other. The work was great and widely spread, and we were separated on the wall, far from each other. In the place where you hear the sound of the trumpet, rally to us there. Our God will fight for us. Let every man and his servant pass the night within Jerusalem, so that it may be a guard for us by night, and may be labor by day. So none of us took off our clothes. Each kept his weapon in his right hand. So to reiterate, the action that was taken is really unity, to bring people together within the walls to spend the night to do the building, but also in really in prayer, right? As a way to relate with this, the weapons that we're holding in one hand and building with the other, it's symbolic of prayer, of knowing the word and fighting that spiritual battle, right? It's not a physical battle in this case. And again, I put here that we have this Monday prayer meeting every night for the youth group, and I personally see this as very important for my spiritual life, because it's been a source where we can pray for each other and cover for each other when things do get tough, when things are causing tiredness, when the enemy starts employing these kind of tactics to create this tiredness. And I should say, why would the enemy want to make you tired? Have you ever thought about that? Because when you are tired, you lose that fighting spirit. If you're a soldier in the battlefield and you are tired because the enemy just keeps going on and on and on, it's demoralizing. It removes that fighting spirit from you, and you stop fighting, right? So that's why the enemy wants to do this. All right, so now we look at another interesting point. I was debating whether I want to put this one in because the book actually didn't talk about this. But as I was reading Nehemiah, this came as a really, it really convicted my heart when I read this part. So let's read this verse. So it says that we are mortgaging our fields, our vineyards, and our houses to get grain because of the famine. So the context is there was a famine in the land at the time, and people who were living in the city needed food. So they were selling their land, they were selling things to get that, right? Now our flesh is the flesh of our brothers. Our children are as their children. Yet we are forcing our sons and daughters to be slaves. I brought charges against the nobles and the officials, and I said to them, you are exacting interest, each from his brother. So I said, the thing you are doing is not good. Ought you not walk in the fear of our God to prevent the taunts of the nations and our enemies? Let us abandon this exacting of interest. So what does this mean? What is this exacting of interest? How does this relate to us in a spiritual sense? When I was meditating on this verse, I was just thinking, is it possible that as fellow brothers and sisters, that we hold each other in captivity? Because in whatever means for you, this is something, again, that we have to come to God and have God search our hearts for. But it's quite peculiar, because how is it that these people who have escaped captivity from Babylon are now in this land, are now subjecting each other to captivity yet again? So we can ask this question to ourselves. Could we be holding each other in captive, seeking to gain from each other? Could we be trying to gain something from our relationship with our brothers and sisters rather than give something? We heard about this topic of decreasing ourselves so that Christ may increase. This captivity is the exact opposite of that, is decreasing others so that I may increase. So something to ask the Lord about. And the action that I didn't really include here, I kind of just bulleted at the very end. But Nehemiah, after saying this, his response was actually a generous outpouring of food and supplies. Because he was the governor of the land at the time, he was entitled to a certain amount of grain to livestock from the people. Instead, he didn't take any of that. He said he gave out his own stock of livestock and grain. So for him, it was a decrease of what he had to benefit the body. So now we kind of take another turn around this kind of peculiar warfare. So we looked at what the enemy is doing from the outside, and now we looked at what's happening on the inside. Now the enemy sees that the work is still not stopping. The wall is being finished, and the people are still in good spirits. So now we come to the point where the enemy starts to play some spycraft. He starts trying to infiltrate in other ways. One of the ways that they did it is, we can see it in this verse. So this is now in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 2. It says, Sanballat and Geshem sent to me, saying, come, let us meet together at Hakkephirim in the plains of Ono. But they were intended to do me harm. And I sent messengers to them saying, I am doing a great work, and I cannot come down. Why should the work stop while I leave it and come down to you? And they sent me 4 times in this way, and I answered to them in the same manner. So, how can we relate to this? I'm sure the people who are aware of the message of this church knows that it's not exactly a very inviting one. It's not an easy one to accept. And for me, if I look at this, I think it is very tempting sometimes to kind of let go of the message, compromise on the message, to make it more inviting, make it more so that we can bring more people into the church. But that almost feels to me like accepting a meeting with the people outside the walls and say, well, let's work something out. Maybe we don't have to have this conflict. So, yeah, there could be any circumstances in our own lives that may seem, fine at first. It might seem okay. Like the Sanballat and Geshem just wants to meet and talk, right? But Nehemiah had the wisdom to understand that this was not really meant to be as a peace talk, but rather as an assassination attempt, actually. They were looking to kill him. So in this way, we don't want to compromise because we are drawing out our own end. And next we have misrepresentation. So what is this? Let's read this verse. This is now in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 6 to 8. So they sent for the 5th time another letter. This time it's a public letter. His servant to me with an open letter in his hand. It was written, it is reported among the nations, and Geshem also says it, that you and the Jews intend to rebel. That is why you are building the wall, and according to these reports, you wish to become their king. So now come and let us take counsel together. Then I said to him, saying, no such things as you say have been done. You are inventing them out of your own mind. So what is the enemy doing here? The enemy is trying to use lies and slander to bring Nehemiah into that position of compromise. And I wrote here, it's a particularly cruel tactic for the enemy to use, especially if you are part of the building of the wall and you've been doing it with a pure heart, with a full dedicated heart, and you have no ill intentions at all. And now the enemy is saying that, oh, you're just doing this to get money, you're doing this to gain fame, you're doing this to become a king, right? And that's particularly damaging to you as a person because I'm not doing any of this, right? I want to clear my name. But Nehemiah's response is very interesting. He simply just says, no such thing has been done. That's not the truth. And I don't need to prove myself to you because I know that I'm doing God's work. So it's almost saying like, if I fail, and I fail mightily, then you and I both know that I've been doing this for my own sake, that I've been doing this for my, gain or whatever. But look at what we're doing, look at the people inside, look and see what they're doing, and the truth will speak for itself. God is doing this work, it's not me. That's where he's coming from. And lastly, this is very, very sneaky of the enemy to do, intimidation. So let's read this verse. This is now in Nehemiah chapter 6, verse 10. So this is all stringed together in a sequence, like all in the same chapter 6. So now when I went into the house of Shemaiah, who was confined to his home, he said, let us meet together in the house of God, within the temple. Let us close the doors of the temple, for they are coming to kill you. They as in the enemy. But I said, should such a man as I run away? And what man such as I should go into the temple and live? So I guess the context of this is that the Old Testament law still applied. So unless you were the high priest, you could not enter into the temple. And I understood that and saw that God had not sent him, but he had pronounced the prophecy against me because Tobiah and Sanballat had hired him. For this purpose he was hired, that I should be afraid and act in this way and sin. And so they could give me a bad name in order to taunt me. So the enemy is trying to use even he will stop at nothing. He's using friends and almost people that we know as ways to bring us into, again, this position of compromise, to enter in his kingdoms, into the temple, so that they might kill him. And how can we relate to this? Well, it doesn't have to be actually a friend. There's the spiritual connection with this. It could be anything that instills this kind of fear in us to say, well, I'm going to compromise my position. The enemy could say, whatever it is in your life, that brings this fear in you, that puts you in a position where you could put God on the side almost and say that, well, maybe it's better if I don't fully commit to this. Maybe it's better if I don't put myself out there and stand for the full purpose of God. And there's an example in the New Testament where there's a very interesting interaction between Jesus and Peter. Because when Peter found out that Christ was going to be crucified, he said, I forget exactly what he said, but he tried to prevent Christ from doing that. And Jesus' response to him was very, very stern. He said, "Get behind me, Satan." Why? Because Peter was like this friend in this example that was saying to Nehemiah, come to the temple, right, so that they might not kill you. Jesus was going to die on the cross, and Peter was telling Jesus, come with me so that they don't kill you. But Jesus knew that the plan and purpose of God was primary, and he could not compromise for that. So he called it out and said to Peter, Satan, get behind me. All right, so we're at the end now. So that was a lot. That was a lot of things going through like all of Nehemiah. But I want to kind of summarize this in a few key takeaways. Let's start from what we talked about in the beginning. So the full plan and purpose of God, when that is in view and that is understood by a body, and when that's being executed upon and made real, we can expect intense conflict and oppression from the enemy. And that kind of conflict can come in many forms, but all with one single purpose, which is to halt the great work that's being done. And as we've gone through all of these tactics, there are some common themes in what Nehemiah did to kind of defend against them. And if we look through them, the first one is having this shared vision and purpose. If we don't have this shared vision of God's plan and purpose and trying to and understand the necessity of this, we talked about this so much in the previous sessions about why it is necessary to fight, then we are kind of dead in our walk already. We have to know what this vision is, and we have to have a heart for it. Another thing that Nehemiah did constantly was being on watchful and being on guard. He knew what was happening. He knew what was happening around the world. He knew what was happening around people around him. So he was fully aware when the enemy did try to be sneaky with him. And tied in with this watchfulness is this lifting things in prayer to the Lord intelligently. Because we cannot do everything. Ultimately, this battle is the Lord's. And in prayer, we make this a matter to the Lord's and not ours. In so many ways, the enemy is trying to discredit us when we're doing things, and we take it personally, right? And we take that as a discouragement to stop the work. But really, that's not what the enemy is doing. The enemy is actually attacking God's purpose. It's not our purpose. And lastly, we have to maintain this unity. None of what Nehemiah did would have been possible if the people weren't united. This is the primary foundation for everything of fighting against, or standing up against this peculiar warfare, is to maintaining that unity. We have to pray for each other. We have to be like Nehemiah and talk with each other. And if anybody is in tiredness or is in a period of like being, what did we say about this? Where we lose our fighting spirit, then we have to lift each other up in prayer and maintain that unity. So I want to end with a question to you. Do any of these tactics that we went through apply to your life today? And when those challenges come, when those tactics come in your life, let us learn from Nehemiah and have that unified stance, sharing in that vision of God's full plan and purpose, so that we may welcome that challenge, because we know that challenge means that something good is happening. We're on the right track. And let us not fear, because fear is the ultimate. I think there was a verse from a book called Dune. It says, fear is the something killer. I can't quite remember it, but this is exactly it. We cannot let fear eat ourselves from the inside out. And that is all I wanted to share today. So I hope it has been a blessing. And let's just close with a word of prayer as well.